The winter wind moved through Briar Glen with a low and steady sound, brushing past wooden roofs, stone walls, and narrow paths lined with old snow. The village sat deep in a cold valley below dark mountains, where people woke early, worked hard, and went to sleep with their doors barred tight. Most days felt small and quiet, yet everyone knew the mountains kept secrets, and everyone feared the old shrine on the ridge above the creek. That ruined place had once belonged to the first winter priests, until the ruling order from Greywatch burned its records and called the old rites dangerous. Eren, a young man with soft brown hair and careful gray eyes, worked as the village courier, and he wanted only one thing: to stay useful, stay unnoticed, and bring every message home without causing trouble. He was kind, but he was timid, and the people of Briar Glen often forgot him the moment he turned away. The one person who never forgot him was his younger sister, Lila, a bright girl with black hair and a brave smile, who believed Eren could do more than deliver notes and parcels. She said he carried things for everyone else, so someday he would have to carry something for himself. That idea made Eren nervous because the village had been uneasy for weeks. Hunters reported strange tracks near the snowline, bells rang too often at night, and the traders spoke in whispers about a demon legion gathering beyond the mountains. The danger was clear, and the stake was simple. If the army came down, Briar Glen would be overwhelmed, the farms would be ruined, and the valley would lose the only home it had ever known. The ruling order said people should trust their guards and obey their laws, but Eren could see that their protection was thin, and their fear was thick. When the first hard snow of the season fell, Eren was sent to carry a bundle of sealed letters to the ruined shrine, because the old path had become the fastest way across the ridge. He hated the route, but he obeyed because that was his life. The shrine stood under broken stone arches and frozen vines, with a cracked statue in its center and a hollow chamber buried below. Inside the lower room, Eren found something the village never mentioned: a round stone seal with a pale blue frost sigil carved into its face. The symbol looked simple, yet it made his skin sting and his breath turn sharp in the air. The moment he touched it, the seal cracked open with a cold flash, and the shrine filled with silver mist. Eren stumbled back, trembling, as the sigil burned itself into the palm of his right hand. He did not understand what had happened, but the power answered him at once. Water on the floor froze into glass. Dust turned white. Even his own fear seemed to slow. A voice, thin as winter glass, moved through his mind and told him that the frost sigil had chosen him because his heart still held room for restraint. That voice did not sound kind, and it did not sound cruel. It sounded ancient, like something that had waited a long time to be found. Eren fled the shrine and tried to hide the mark, but the cold followed him. When he reached the village, the elders of Greywatch were already there, led by Commander Victor, a tall man with black hair, a silver cloak, and hard blue eyes. Victor was the local voice of the ruling order, and he claimed to protect Briar Glen from forbidden forces. In truth, he feared any power he could not control, because the ruling order had built its rule by crushing old magic and burying every record that might weaken its authority. Victor saw the frost mark on Eren before Eren could hide it, and his face turned cold with anger. He ordered Eren watched, searched, and silenced if needed. To Victor, the sigil was not a gift. It was proof that the old power had returned, and that return could inspire people to question Greywatch. So the danger grew from two sides at once. The Demon Legion was coming from the mountains, and the ruling order wanted the sigil erased before anyone learned the truth. Eren, who had never chosen a fight in his life, suddenly stood in the middle of one. The attack came at dusk 3 days later, when the mountain bells began to ring by themselves. Black shapes poured out of the snowfields above the village, and the Demon Legion moved downhill in a crawling wave of claws, smoke, and broken armor. They were not mindless beasts. Their leader, a horned war mage named Damien, rode at the front on a huge ash-colored beast, and his voice carried over the wind as he promised to take the valley and break every seal hidden beneath it. Damien wanted the shrine and the frost sigil because he believed the sigil was one half of a door, and that door would let his legion spread beyond the mountain line. He did not want simple ruin. He wanted a path to power, and he knew the ruling order had hidden that path from everyone else. When the village guards rushed to defend the gate, they were overwhelmed within moments. Victor and his soldiers fought hard, but their steel could not hold the line alone. Eren wanted to run, and for a few heartbeats he almost did. Then he saw Lila trapped near the well with falling timber around her, and fear turned into something else. He ran, raised his marked hand, and the air around him exploded into white frost. A wall of ice surged up from the ground and stopped the first charge. Eren stared at his own hands in shock. He had no training, no plan, and no clear idea whether this power came from a blessing or a curse. Still, the sigil answered his need. He learned fast because he had to. When he focused on protecting, the frost formed shields, steps, and spears of frozen wind. When he panicked, the cold spread too far and cracked the stones under his feet. Lila watched him with wide eyes, but she did not turn away. She told him to breathe, look at the line in front of him, and keep choosing what to protect. Her trust steadied him more than any lesson could have. Together, they drove the first wave back from the square, and the villagers saw Eren in a new way. Yet Victor saw something else. He saw a power that might rival Greywatch, and he feared that more than the demons. So when Eren collapsed after the battle, drained and shaking, Victor moved his soldiers closer, ready to seize him before the boy could grow stronger. At the same time, one of the fallen demon masks near the gate cracked open, revealing a symbol that matched the frost sigil in a broken and twisted form. That was the first twist no one expected. The old winter power and the demon invasion were connected. The shrine had not hidden a simple weapon. It had hidden a lock, and someone had begun opening it from both sides. That night, while the village burned with small fires and loud fears, Eren sat inside the chapel with his hand wrapped in cloth, trying to understand what he had become. He had saved lives, but the cold inside him felt restless, almost hungry. The voice from the shrine returned in pieces, saying that the frost force was never made to destroy first, only to stop what should not pass. Yet it also warned that too much fear could turn the gift inward, twisting ice into a prison for the heart. Eren began to understand the real danger. If he used the sigil only from panic, he might become no better than the force trying to break the valley. If he used it with mercy and control, he might become something stronger than both the demons and the ruling order. Victor came to the chapel before midnight without soldiers and told Eren the truth in a hard and bitter voice. Long ago, Greywatch had found records of the Frost Priests and the Mountain Seals. They learned that the sigil could command winter itself, but only by binding the user to strict restraint. The Order feared that a single reckless bearer could freeze crops, roads, and armies alike, so they erased every trace and declared the power forbidden. Victor said he did not hate Eren. He feared what Eren might become because he had seen old bearers lose themselves and turn whole lands into glass. That was the deeper reason behind his cruelty, and it made him more dangerous, not less. Then the chapel windows shattered and Damien stepped into the firelight with two shadow guards behind him. He laughed because the seal had already begun to weaken. He said the ruling order had buried the truth, but truth always left cracks. He also revealed the second twist, plain and sharp. Eren had not been chosen by chance. His family line had once guarded the lower shrine, and his mother had hidden the final key inside the courier route before she vanished years ago. Eren was not a random village boy. He was the last living link to the old seal. That truth struck him harder than the attack. All his life, he had thought he was ordinary. Now he learned he had been carrying a hidden role from the start. Damien demanded the key, Victor demanded control, and Eren stood between them with ice gathering around his feet. He could feel the frost sigil pulling toward both fire and fear, and he understood that this was only the beginning. So he made his first true choice as the night closed in. He stepped forward, raised his marked hand, and promised to protect Briar Glen, even if the path ahead forced him to face the line between holy power and demonic ruin on his own. The cold light around him grew brighter, the chapel shadows stretched long against the walls, and somewhere beyond the mountain ridge, more wings began to move in the dark. The chapel of Briar Glen stood quiet on the hill, with old stone walls, narrow windows, and a roof worn by many winters. Outside, the village lights glowed softly under a sky that had turned dark and heavy. The mountain wind moved through the trees, and every sound seemed larger than it should have been. Inside the chapel, Sigil stood at the center of that stillness, with his marked hand raised and a cold light circling his fingers. He was a young man with black hair, a lean build, and tired eyes that had seen too much fear for one night. He wanted to protect the people below because he had grown up among them, and because he knew the strange mark on his hand was no longer something he could hide. Father Caleb, a serious older man with gray hair, watched from the altar steps with a face full of worry. He was the village priest, and he wanted the chapel seal to stay strong because he understood that old protections only worked when people still believed in them. Mara, a brave woman with brown hair and a worn travel coat, stood near the door with one hand on a lantern. She was the village healer, and she wanted everyone to live through the night because she had already helped too many frightened families in too many hard seasons. The danger was simple and terrible. Something beyond the ridge had noticed Sigil, and if it reached the chapel, the old seal under the floor could break open. Then whatever had been waiting in the dark would pour into Briar Glen, and the village would have no wall strong enough to stop it. Sigil felt that danger in his bones when the light around his hand turned brighter. It was not warm like fire, and it was not gentle like moonlight. It was cold and clear, and it moved like it was listening. Father Caleb took one slow step toward him and said that the mark had been seen before, long ago, in the oldest records of the chapel. He explained that the mark belonged to a line of chosen guardians, people who were meant to stand between the village and the sealed darkness under the hill. He also said that the same power could draw in corrupted spirits, because anything sealed away for too long began to hunger. Mara looked at Sigil with fear and hope mixed together, because she could see that he was not a hero from legend, but a frightened young man who had chosen to stay. Sigil swallowed hard and asked what he was supposed to do now. Father Caleb told him the truth in plain words. He had to hold the seal until dawn, and he had to resist the pull of the dark power that wanted to answer his mark. If he failed, the chapel would become the doorway and the valley would be lost. Sigil nodded once, even though his heart was racing, because he understood that a promise made in fear still counted if it was kept in truth. Then the first sign of the enemy came with a sound like distant wings. It rolled over the mountain ridge in a low, ugly rush, and the village dogs began to bark. Mara rushed to the doorway and opened it just enough to look outside. She saw shapes moving between the pines, tall and thin, with dark cloaks snapping in the wind and pale faces hidden under hoods. These were not wild beasts, and they were not ordinary raiders. They were watchers for Victor, the man leading the attack. Victor was a hard, clever villain with silver gray hair, sharp eyes, and a voice that stayed calm even when his plans were cruel. He wanted Sigil because he believed the marked hand could unlock the sealed path under the chapel. Victor had studied the old stories, and he knew the seal hid more than danger. It also hid a source of power that could give him control over the valley and the lands beyond it. He was not attacking from simple hatred. He was attacking because he wanted the hidden power for himself, and he was willing to frighten the whole village to get it. As the watchers spread out below the hill, Father Caleb grabbed the chapel bell rope and rang it hard. The deep sound woke the town, and windows opened one after another. Men, women, and children came out in fear, carrying lanterns, tools, and anything they thought might help. Sigil saw their faces and felt the weight of their trust. He was no longer standing alone, but that made the choice harder, not easier. The next moments moved fast. The watchers began to climb the hill, and the wind grew colder with each step they took. Sigil felt the cold light in his hand pull toward them, almost as if it knew their fear and wanted to feed on it. At the same time, a hot surge flickered under his skin, like a hidden fire trying to wake up. That was the first true sign that his mark held two forces at once, one that could bless and one that could burn. Father Caleb saw the change and called out that the mark was not just a gift, it was a test. The old guardians had used it to close doors, but some had lost control and let the dark side slip free. That was why the records had been locked away. They were not hidden to protect the village from enemies alone. They were hidden to protect the village from failed guardians too. Sigil stared at his hand, shocked by the truth, and he understood the deepest fear of the chapel. The village had not only feared the dark below the hill, it had also feared what a guardian might become. That was why his mark had been ignored for so long, and that was why his choice mattered now more than ever. Mara moved beside him and pressed a small iron charm into his palm. She told him it belonged to her mother, who had used it in hard winters to remind herself that fear could be carried, not obeyed. Then she told him to breathe, watch the light, and choose only one motion at a time. Her simple words gave him something solid to hold onto. Outside, Victor finally stepped into view at the bottom of the hill. He was tall, calm, and dressed in a dark coat that moved like smoke in the wind. He raised one hand and called up to the chapel in a voice that carried easily through the night. He said he did not want to destroy Briar Glen. He wanted what was buried there, because the world outside the valley had already grown cruel, and only power would keep him from being crushed by stronger men. It was a terrible kind of reason, but it was still a reason, and that made him more dangerous. Sigil heard the words and realized Victor truly believed his own story. That made the fight harder, because a liar could be argued with, but a man who felt justified would not stop for shame. Then Victor gave a quiet signal and the watchers rushed forward. The hill erupted in motion. lantern light shook. Stones rolled under boots. The villagers formed a line near the chapel steps, not with swords, but with farming poles, iron tools, and desperate courage. Father Caleb began to pray over the seal, and the floor under Igil responded with a low pulse that traveled through the stone. The mark on Igil's hand flared once more, brighter than before, and the cold light formed a thin arc in the air. He lifted his arm toward the oncoming watchers, not in anger, but in refusal. The arc struck the ground in front of them and burst into shining dust, forcing the first wave to stop and shield their eyes. The crowd behind him gasped, because none of them had expected such power from a young man who only hours before had looked lost and unsure. Igil himself was shaken by what he had done because part of him had enjoyed the force of it, and that feeling scared him more than the enemy did. The watchers did not retreat for long. They spread out, trying to circle the hill, while Victor watched with cool patience from below. He knew the village was not ready for a long fight, and he was counting on fear to do the rest. That was when the chapel floor answered again. A crack of pale light opened between the stones near the altar, and a whisper rose from below, soft as breath on glass. Father Caleb went pale because he recognized the sound. The seal was reacting to Igil, and something under the chapel had begun to wake. He shouted for everyone to hold their ground and not panic, because panic would feed the break. Igil knelt near the crack and felt a rush of images: an old chamber, a chain of runes, and a gate sealed by the first guardians long ago. Then he saw the real surprise that changed everything. The thing under the chapel was not only a prison, it was also a lock, and the mark on his hand was the key that could open it from the inside. If Victor gained control of Igil, he would not need to break the chapel walls at all. He could use Igil to unlock what had been buried for generations. The truth hit Igil like ice water. This was why the mark had called to both fire and fear. It was built for a sacred purpose, but it could also serve ruin if used by the wrong will. He looked toward the door, then toward the crack in the floor, then toward the villagers who were watching him with trust and terror. For the first time, he understood that his battle was not only against Victor. It was also against the part of himself that wanted power to solve everything quickly. So Igil made another choice. He did not give in to the hot surge. He did not chase the cold hunger either. Instead, he lowered his marked hand over the crack and spoke the simple promise he had made when the night began. He said he would protect Briar Glen no matter how hard the path became. The cold light gathered around his fingers, then spread through the stone in clean lines like water finding a channel. Father Caleb began to recite the oldest words he knew, not with grand force but with steady faith. Mara stepped beside Igil and held the lantern high so he could see the floor clearly. The villagers behind them joined in, one voice at a time, until the whole chapel filled with a low chorus of courage. Outside, Victor saw the light change and understood that the village was no longer easy to frighten. His calm face hardened and he ordered the watchers to press harder. The hill shook with their rush and several windows shattered under the pressure. But the seal did not fail. Instead, it rose with the mark, bending the light into a shield above the chapel floor. Igil felt strain tear through his arm, yet he held on because now he was holding more than a spell. He was holding the trust of everyone in Briar Glen. The sound of wings grew louder beyond the ridge, and something far larger answered Victor from the dark sky. The night was not over. The true attack was still coming. And as the chapel light pulsed against the dark, Igil stood at the center of it all, shaken, changed, and ready to face whatever would rise next. The chapel in Briar Glen stood on the hill like a small stone heart, and the whole village seemed to beat around it with fear. Lantern light trembled in the windows below, pine branches bent in the wind, and the narrow paths between the cottages stayed empty because everyone had already heard the sound coming from the ridge. It was the sound of wings, huge wings, heavy wings, and they moved through the night like a warning. Inside the chapel, Father Caleb stood near the altar with his gray hair neat against his tired face, his dark maroon robe falling straight around his thin frame, and his wooden cross held tight in one careful hand. He was the priest of Briar Glen, and he wanted only one thing now, which was to keep his people alive long enough to see dawn. Beside him was Mara, a brave woman with brown hair tied back for travel, light skin, and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Her worn coat was dusty, her boots were wet from the path, and her small satchel hung at her side because she had spent the night carrying messages, water, and hope from house to house. She was not a soldier, but she had become the voice that kept people moving when fear tried to freeze them. In the center of the chapel floor stood Igil, a young man with black hair, pale skin, tired gray eyes, and a lean body that looked smaller than the weight he carried. His dark brown tunic was torn at the sleeve, his worn gray cloak hung open, and his leather gloves were stretched tight over his hands. His right hand glowed with cold white light, and the marked skin pulsed like a living key pressed against old stone. He was shaking, but he did not let go of the shield he had raised above the floor, because if the seal broke, the chamber below would open, and whatever slept there would not remain hidden for long. Victor wanted that chamber for a reason, and everyone in the chapel knew it now. He was not attacking Briar Glen for sport. He wanted the old power below the chapel, because the seal was the only thing standing between his control and something ancient enough to change the mountain forever. The light of the shield flickered, and Sigil felt the strain run all the way through his arm and into his shoulder. He clenched his jaw, kept his feet apart, and forced his breathing to stay slow. Father Caleb saw the pain in him at once, and he stepped closer without touching the glowing mark. He had learned that the marked hand could not be treated like a normal wound or a normal gift. It was tied to the seal, tied to the old guardians, and tied to a promise no one in the village fully understood anymore. Years ago, when the chapel was repaired after a storm, Caleb had found carved lines under the stone floor, and he had studied the old records long enough to know one thing for certain. The seal was not only a lock, it was also a warning. It held back a force that the first builders of Briar Glen had trusted to the ground instead of the sky, because they feared what would happen if greedy hands ever reached it. Victor had found the same records, but he had read them with selfish eyes. He wanted the power below the chapel because he believed strength belonged to the ones smart enough to claim it. He believed the guardians of old had been fools, and he wanted to prove that the world should belong to a mind like his. Mara heard that truth from a captured scout earlier that night, and she had rushed it back to the chapel because the village needed to know that Victor was not coming for simple destruction. He was coming for conquest. Then the wind outside changed. The low sound of wings grew louder, and another noise answered it from above the ridge, deep and rough, like something larger beating through the dark. The chapel windows shook. Dust fell from the beams. Mara looked at the door, then back at Sigil, and she realized the first wave had only been a test. Victor had been watching, waiting, and measuring the strength of the shield before sending the real threat. Sigil swallowed hard, and for one brief moment, his tired gray eyes filled with doubt. He had never asked to be the center of a village defense. He had never wanted to be the only thing standing between fear and disaster. He had come to Briar Glen carrying only the strange mark on his hand and the need to find out why it had chosen him. But the village had given him food, shelter, and trust, and now he could feel that trust pressing on him harder than any spell. Mara noticed the change in his face, and she moved beside him with a steady look that was warm even through the fear. She was younger than Father Caleb and far less patient, but she knew something important about people. Fear grows faster than courage unless someone speaks first. So she placed the small iron charm in Sigil's free palm, the worn little piece of dark silver cold against his glove. It was not magical in any grand way. It had belonged to her mother, and her mother had carried it during storms, bad winters, and long nights when the mountain road was blocked. Mara told him to hold it and remember that courage could be small and still be real. Sigil tightened his fingers around it, and the cold metal helped anchor his thoughts. Father Caleb then spoke in a calm, clear voice so the people gathered near the chapel wall could hear him. He said that the seal below their feet had been made to protect the village, but it could only hold if someone alive and willing stayed connected to it. That person was Sigil now. If he let go, the hidden chamber would answer the mark and the lock would fail. That truth settled over the room like a heavy cloth, and the villagers who had been whispering in panic grew silent. They were afraid, but they were no longer confused. They understood what was at stake. If Victor reached the seal, he would turn the ancient protection into a weapon, and Briar Glen would no longer be a safe place for children, families, or anyone who had ever trusted the chapel bell to ring them home. Then the attack began in earnest. The chapel roof groaned as a dark shape passed overhead, too large to be seen clearly through the storm cloud cover, yet massive enough to blot out the lantern glow outside. A rush of air struck the hilltop, and the front door slammed against its frame. At the same time, pale shapes moved near the ridge, fast and sharp, like Victor had sent scouts ahead of the greater force. Mara ran to the side window and saw movement between the pines, figures in dark layers climbing with practiced steps. They were not villagers, and they were not wild creatures either. They were Victor's followers, men and women who had joined him because he promised order, safety, and power once the seal was open. That made them dangerous in a different way, because each one believed they were helping build a stronger future. Victor had used that promise before, and it worked because fear can make bad choices look wise. He stepped into view for the first time on the ridge path, tall and still, with silver gray hair, sharp eyes, and a long dark coat that moved only when the wind forced it. Black gloves covered his hands, and his voice carried easily across the night when he called down to the chapel. He told Sigil to stop fighting and give the seal over, because the old guardians were gone and their rules were dead. He said Briar Glen had been trapped by faith for too long, and that only someone willing to take power would ever save it from the weak. Father Caleb answered him from the chapel steps with a voice that did not shake, and he said that Victor wanted control, not salvation. Victor smiled at that because he did not deny it. He said control was the only honest answer in a cruel world. Then something answered him from the sky behind the ridge, and even Victor lifted his head for a moment. The sound was enormous now, not a simple wing beat, but a full presence gathering behind the cloud line, as if a larger force had heard his call and come to claim the night for itself. The chapel floor flashed brighter, and the old stone cracks around the seal began to glow with pale lines, almost like a hidden map waking up under the wood and stone. Sigil felt the marked hand pull hard, as if the seal wanted more than holding now. It wanted direction. That was the twist none of them had expected, and it changed everything in one terrible instant. Father Caleb had believed the seal was only a barrier, but the old records he had studied were incomplete. The seal was also a test, and it responded to the will of the one connected to it. If Sigil held fear in his heart, the chamber below would remain closed but unstable, and the strain would crush him. If he pushed with rage, the seal might break in the wrong way and release whatever waited below without control. Mara saw the danger before anyone else because she watched his hand and saw the light begin to change. It was no longer only cold and white, it was becoming steady. That steadiness did not come from strength alone. It came from choice. Sigil looked at the villagers, at Father Caleb, and at Mara with her iron charm still in his palm, and he finally understood that the mark did not make him powerful because he was special. It made him powerful because he had been trusted to decide what kind of person he would be under pressure. He drew one slow breath, planted his boots on the chapel floor, and stopped trying to force the shield alone. Instead, he listened to the pattern beneath the stone, and he let the seal guide his grip. The glowing lines spread wider in response, and the shield above the floor changed shape into a stronger ring of light. That was enough to drive the first wave back from the door, but not enough to end the night. Victor saw the change, and for the first time his cold face sharpened with real concern. He had expected fear. He had not expected understanding. The ridge behind him trembled again, and the huge thing in the sky answered with a deeper sound, as if it was lowering itself toward Briar Glen at last. Father Caleb whispered that the true battle was only beginning. Mara pulled the villagers farther from the windows, and Sigil stood in the center of the chapel with the iron charm in one hand and the marked hand blazing in the other, ready to face whatever was about to rise above the hill. The chapel stood still for one short breath, and then the whole night seemed to lean closer. Outside, Briar Glen lay under dark pine trees and narrow lantern roads, with every stone cottage pressed tight against the hill as if the village itself wanted to hide. The wind moved over the ridge in long, cold waves, and the sky above the chapel was no longer empty. It held a heavy shape that none of them could fully see, only feel, as if something vast was lowering itself toward the village with patient hunger. Sigil stood in the center of the old floor, a lean young man with black hair, pale skin, and tired gray eyes, and his marked right hand burned with cold white light. In his left hand, he held the worn iron charm that had become his small anchor against fear. Father Caleb, the thin priest with gray hair and a calm but worried face, stayed near the altar with his wooden cross held tight against his chest. Mara, the brave woman with brown hair and alert green eyes, kept the villagers behind the pews where they crouched together in silence. All of them knew the same awful truth now. If the thing above the ridge reached the chapel, it would not just break stone. It would tear open the old seal below the floor, and whatever slept beneath it would wake in full power. Father Caleb was the first to speak because his voice was steady even when his hands were not. He told Sigil the truth that had been hidden for too many years. The chapel was not only a place of prayer. Long ago, the first priests of Briar Glen had built it over an ancient chamber, and the chamber had been sealed with holy lines cut into the stone itself. Those lines were still there, hidden under dust and old cracks, waiting for a hand like Sigil. The marked hand was not a curse alone. It was a key, but it was also a warning. It answered only to truth, courage, and a strong will. If fear ruled the one who carried it, the seal could twist open in the wrong way and let the wrong thing through. Sigil listened with his jaw tight because he understood at last why so many people had looked at his hand with dread. It was never meant to make him powerful for pride. It was meant to choose whether the village lived in safety or in ruin. Mara looked from Father Caleb to Sigil, and she saw the same burden in both of them. She had no magic, but she had sharp eyes, strong hands, and a fierce need to keep the people around her from being broken by terror. So she began gathering the villagers into the back room, telling the children to stay low and telling the older ones to listen for her voice. She moved like someone who had already decided that panic would not be allowed to win. Then the chapel floor gave a slow, ugly tremble, and all sound stopped for a moment. Dust shook loose from the beams overhead. A pale line of light flashed once across the old stone cracks, then another, and soon the hidden seal beneath the chapel floor began to show itself in thin, glowing threads. Sigil felt the cold mark on his right hand answer with a hard pulse. The iron charm in his other hand grew warm, as if it remembered a promise from long ago. Outside, the shape in the sky answered with a deeper sound, and the windows rattled in their frames. It was not simply a monster. It was a watcher, a guardian that had been twisted by old fear and careful lies. Victor had brought it here, and that truth finally rose clear in Sigil's mind. Victor stood at the edge of the chapel doorway, tall and still, with silver-gray hair and a long dark coat that looked almost like a shadow cut into human form. His black gloves rested at his sides, and his sharp eyes held no panic at all. He was not here to destroy the seal by accident. He wanted it opened. Long before this night, Victor had learned that the chamber below the chapel held a power that could control the sky creature and silence the ancient guardians. He believed that if he could command that force, he could end fear forever, and no one would ever threaten him with the unknown again. That was the cruel center of his plan. He had not come as a madman. He had come as a man who had trusted control more than trust, and who now wanted the world to obey him. Mara saw Victor first, and her voice cut through the chapel like a bell. She warned the others not to listen to him, because men like Victor always spoke about order when they meant control. Victor answered with calm words that made his danger even worse. He said the village had lived in ignorance for too long, and the seal below the chapel had only delayed a larger disaster. He claimed that the creature above the ridge was already bound to the old chamber, and that once the seal fully opened, he could direct its power and spare Briar Glen from being crushed between forces it did not understand. Father Caleb did not move toward him, but his face grew harder because he understood the truth behind the lie. Victor was partly right about the danger, and that was what made him so dangerous. The seal had been built not to trap a simple beast, but to hold a broken balance. If the chamber opened without care, the thing in the sky would lose its restraint, and the guardians below would follow the call of broken power. That was why the old priests had hidden the truth. They feared not only the power itself, but the kind of person who would try to own it. Sigil looked at Victor and felt anger rise, but it was not blind anger anymore. It was sharper now, shaped by understanding. He saw a man who had turned fear into ambition and pain into a plan. He saw someone who believed that if he could control the source of terror, then he would never feel small again. For the first time, Sigil understood that Victor was not stronger than the village. He was just more willing to step over people to reach his goal. The chapel shook again, harder this time, and a section of the floor cracked open with a sharp stone cry. Pale light spilled up from below, bright enough to throw long shadows across the pews and altar. Mara pushed the villagers farther back as Father Caleb raised his cross and began speaking old words in a low, clear voice. The sound was simple, but it steadied the room like a hand on a trembling shoulder. Sigil stepped toward the crack, and the iron charm in his hand flashed dark silver under the white glow of his marked palm. He did not know every answer yet, but he knew what had changed inside him. He was no longer standing there only to survive the night. He was standing there to choose what kind of man he would become. He remembered all the looks of fear, all the times he had wanted to hide his hand, all the lonely hours when he thought the mark had only made him a danger to others. Now he saw that fear had been trying to control him from the start. Victor had used fear. The village had lived under fear. Even the seal had been shaped by fear. But Sigil was still there, and he could still decide. He planted his feet, lifted the glowing hand over the crack, and felt the pulse below answer him in a deep and steady rhythm, not like an attack, but like a lock recognizing a true key. The light widened along the old stone lines, and for one clear moment, the chamber below seemed to breathe. Then a voice rose out of the opening, low and cold and filled with ancient warning, and every person in the chapel froze. Father Caleb looked down into the light with sudden realization because he knew the voice. It belonged to one of the first guardians, and it was not asking to be freed. It was asking who had brought the wrong kind of power to its door. Victor's control finally slipped just enough for the others to see the hunger under it. He stepped forward, reaching toward the crack as if he could force the chamber to obey him by will alone. But Mara moved first, throwing a heavy lantern stand into his path and driving him back from the glowing seal. Father Caleb kept his voice low and sharp, telling Sigil that the seal did not need force. It needed choice. It needed someone brave enough to bind the balance without using it for pride. Sigil heard him, and the meaning struck deep. The mark on his hand was not asking him to take power. It was asking him to carry responsibility. So he lowered the iron charm to the stone, pressed his marked hand beside it, and spoke the simple words Father Caleb taught him in a voice that did not shake. The chapel answered with a deep pulse of light, and the crack beneath them began to close in slow, bright lines. Outside, the huge shape above the ridge gave one final heavy sound, then pulled back from the village sky as if it had lost the path it wanted. Victor stared in shock as his plans slipped away, not destroyed, but denied. Yet even as the light settled and the tremors eased, the voice from below spoke once more, and this time it carried a warning meant for all of them. The chamber was not fully sealed anymore. Someone had already opened a smaller door deeper beneath the chapel, and the true source of the disturbance had not yet been reached. Sigil looked at Father Caleb, then at Mara, and then at the dark opening that still glowed beneath the stone, and he understood that the night was not over. He had held the line, but the story had only moved into a deeper place where older secrets waited, and where the next choice would be even harder than this one. The air under the chapel was cold, still, and heavy with old dust, while pale light leaked from the broken stone lines like a quiet warning. Briar Glen slept above them, with its stone cottages and narrow paths wrapped in pine shadow, but below the chapel floor, the night still felt awake. Sigil stood near the open crack in the stone, his black hair damp with sweat, his tired gray eyes locked on the glow, and his marked right hand pulsing with cold white light. Father Caleb, a thin man with gray hair and a worried, calm face, kept one steady hand near the simple wooden cross at his chest. Mara, a brave woman with brown hair and alert green eyes, held her small satchel close and watched the dark opening with careful breaths. They all knew the same hard truth now. Someone had opened a smaller door deeper beneath the chapel, and if that door reached the true chamber, the seal above them could fail completely. The village could be overwhelmed by whatever had been held below for years, and no one in Briar Glen would be safe. Sigil was the first to step closer, but Father Caleb stopped him with a quick look and a raised hand. Caleb had spent many years guarding holy places, reading old records, and listening to warnings that other people ignored. He understood what was at stake better than anyone there, because the old seal was never meant to hold forever without care. It had been built by the first guardians of the chapel to lock away a force that did not hate in the normal way, but that fed on fear, doubt, and control. Caleb had once believed the seal would stay closed as long as the village kept faith, but now he saw that faith alone was not enough. Someone had learned how to work the hidden stone from the inside, and that meant the threat was no longer only ancient. It was personal, smart, and still close. Mara knelt near the edge and brushed dust from the broken floor with 2 fingers. She was not a priest and not a fighter like the soldiers in old stories, but she was sharp, brave, and good at seeing what others missed. Her brown hair fell forward as she studied the cracks, and then she found a narrow line that ran toward the side wall instead of straight down. That line was not part of the old seal. It was new. She turned her head toward the others and spoke in a low voice that still carried clearly in the tight chamber. A hidden passage had been opened on purpose, and fresh scrape marks in the stone showed that it had been used more than once. That meant someone had been moving in and out under the chapel for some time, and they had not come by accident. They had been planning this night for a long while, waiting for the seal to weaken, waiting for the right mark, and waiting for the right fear. Then a slow sound rolled through the chamber, soft at first, like a door settling deep in stone, and it came from beyond the dark opening. Sigil lifted his marked hand, and the cold white light in his palm grew stronger, answering the sound like a warning bell. The glow did not burn him, but it did pull at him, as if the seal below recognized his blood, his will, and something older than both. Father Caleb looked at the hand, then at the wall, and then at Sigil with sudden understanding. The mark was not only a burden, it was a key. The old guardians had built the seal so that only someone marked by the same holy force could open the final chamber or close it again. That meant the enemy had not simply found a way around the seal. They had been waiting for Sigil all along. Before anyone could speak again, a slow clap echoed from the passage beyond the opening. The sound was calm, measured, and deeply insulting in the small space beneath the chapel. Victor stepped into the weak light with silver-gray hair, sharp eyes, and a cold face that never looked surprised for long. His long dark coat moved like a shadow behind him, and his black gloves made every gesture feel controlled and careful. He looked less like a wild raider and more like a man who had already decided that everyone else was below him. Victor was the one who had been moving through Briar Glen in secret, learning the old stories, tracing the chapel foundation, and using fear to push others out of his way. He wanted the power below because he believed the village was too weak to guard it, and he believed a strong hand should claim it before the wrong people did. In his mind, control was mercy, and mercy belonged to him. Victor smiled when he saw Sigil, and that smile made the chamber feel colder. He did not deny the cracks or the opening below. He welcomed them. He explained, with the calm voice of a man who had already rehearsed every word, that the old chamber did not hold a monster in the simple way a child might imagine. It held a guardian force bound into the chapel stone long ago, a force that could shield a village, warn of danger, and even turn aside dark influence if awakened correctly. But the guardians had also feared what would happen if someone selfish touched it. That was why they had sealed it so carefully. Victor claimed the village had hidden the truth from itself for too long, and he meant to uncover the power before old lies crushed everyone under them. Yet his real reason was easier to see in his eyes. He wanted the power because he wanted to command the people above, and he believed fear would make them obey. Mara stepped forward at once, her green eyes bright with anger, and asked why he had opened the smaller door instead of coming honestly to the chapel. Victor answered by saying that honesty was for people who already had trust. He said Briar Glen would never hand over a sacred power to a stranger, especially not after years of being told to leave the chapel alone. So he had used hidden tools, old maps, and patient pressure to uncover the lower passage first. He had also learned something even more dangerous. The seal did not open to force alone. It answered the marked hand. That was why he had watched Sigil from the first moment the young man entered the village, and why every strange event in Briar Glen seemed to gather around him. Victor had been waiting for the key to walk into place, because he believed the chamber could be claimed only when the right person was trapped between fear and duty. Father Caleb took one slow step forward and held his cross tight, not as a weapon, but as a sign of resolve. He told Victor that a power used for control would always become a trap for the one who grabbed it. He spoke plainly with the weight of someone who had spent his life teaching people to choose care over greed. Victor only tilted his head and said that care had not saved the village from hunger, suspicion, or old silence. He claimed Briar Glen had hidden too much for too long, and that the chapel had become a cage instead of a shield. Then he pointed toward the broken line in the floor and said the chamber below was already moving. Whatever had been sealed there was awake enough to respond, and the mark on Sigil had already changed the rules. If they did nothing, the power would rise on its own. If they rushed ahead, it might overwhelm them. And if Victor reached it first, the village would not simply be threatened, it would be placed under his command. The chamber trembled lightly and dust sifted from the ceiling in thin streams. Sigil felt the pull in his marked hand grow stronger, and for one painful moment he wondered if Victor was right about one thing. Maybe the power did want him, maybe he had never been chosen for rescue, but for responsibility no one else could bear. He remembered the nights of travel, the cold roads, the heavy silence in his own chest, and the way the mark had first lit up when he was desperate and alone. He had carried fear like a stone since then, but Mara had never let him face it by himself, and Father Caleb had never looked at him like a tool. They had looked at him like a person. That mattered more than the mark. With that thought, Sigil closed his fingers around the small iron charm in his other hand, the worn, dark silver piece Mara had given him earlier to steady his heart. The charm felt plain and cold, but it gave him a simple reminder. He did not have to become like Victor to be strong. Then the wall beside the opening cracked with a sharp stone sound, and a hidden panel slid partway aside. A narrow stairway appeared beneath it, descending into deeper dark, where old stone steps vanished under faint white lines that matched the seal above. From below, a low pulse answered Igil's mark, slower now, like a heartbeat under the ground. Victor watched the stairway with open satisfaction, as if the moment had finally arrived, yet even he did not step first. He was careful because he knew the lower chamber held something ancient enough to frighten him too. Mara moved beside Igil, ready to follow, but she kept one eye on Victor, and Father Caleb stayed close enough to guide them both. The three of them had become a small line of trust in a place built for secrets and fear. Igil looked down the stairway and understood that this was the real turning point. The village above was only the beginning. The true chamber waited below. The old guardians were not fully understood, and Victor had already gone too far to turn back. Igil took one breath, tightened his hand around the iron charm, and started toward the steps, while the dark below answered him in a slow, glowing call. The stairway below the chapel was narrow, cold, and old, and the air carried a wet stone smell that made every breath feel heavy. Above them, Briar Glen still looked like a peaceful mountain village with lanterns glowing in its cottages, pine trees bending in the wind, and steep ridges holding the night in place. But down here, under the hilltop chapel, the village looked far away, like a memory that could disappear at any moment. Igil led the way with his marked right hand held close to his chest, while Mara stayed one step behind him, alert and ready, and Father Caleb walked after them with quiet care, his calm face showing deep worry. They all knew the same hard truth now. The old chapel seal was not just a hidden mystery. It was a lock on something ancient and dangerous, and Victor was already inside the story of that danger, pulling it closer to breaking point. If Victor reached the true chamber first, the whole village could be thrown into fear, and whatever slept below could rise without warning. Igil started down the first bend, and the white light in his marked hand answered the dark below with a faint pulse. He had never wanted power, and he had never trusted easy answers, but his hand had become a sign that would not stay silent. Father Caleb had told him the mark was not a curse by itself and not a blessing by itself either. It was a key and a test and a burden that needed a steady heart. That was why Father Caleb mattered now. He was not only a priest from the chapel above. He had studied the old records, guarded the village stories, and tried for years to keep the seal safe without stirring panic. Mara mattered too because she had already chosen to stand with Igil when fear would have been easier. She was a brave woman with sharp eyes and a quick mind, and she wanted the same thing as the others now, which was to keep Briar Glen safe and stop Victor from using secrets as weapons. Victor, however, wanted something very different. He believed control was the only way to survive. He wanted the chamber power because he thought the old guardians could be forced to obey, and he wanted the village silent because silence made people easier to rule. His cold face and careful voice hid one simple truth. He was afraid of being powerless, and that fear had driven him too far to turn back. The stairway opened into a round hall below the chapel, where cracked stone walls glowed with thin pale lines that ran through the floor like veins of moonlight. The old chapel seal was here in full, and it was more beautiful and more frightening than Igil had imagined. The lines in the stone were not random. They formed rings, signs, and careful shapes that seemed to watch anyone who stepped inside. At the center of the floor stood a shallow basin of black stone, and around it rested broken pillars carved with the same symbols. Father Caleb lowered his voice and said that the seal had been built long ago by the first guardians of Briar Glen, men and women who had learned that some powers could not be destroyed, only locked away. He explained that the chamber below did not hold treasure. It held a force that listened to fear, fed on weakness, and answered only to a chosen hand. That was why the marked hand mattered so much. Igil had not been given that mark by chance. The old records said the seal would awaken for one who could carry both fear and mercy without breaking. Mara looked at Igil then, and though she was tense, she gave him a small nod. She trusted him, and that trust steadied him more than any speech could. Then the chamber gave a low hum, and the glow in the stone deepened, as if the darkness itself had heard their footsteps. Victor stepped out from behind one of the broken pillars, and his presence changed the room at once. He stood tall in his long dark coat, black gloves, and high boots, with silver-gray hair catching the dim light like cold metal. His sharp eyes moved from Igil to Father Caleb to Mara, and his expression showed calm control, but not peace. He had already reached the chamber first, and in his hands he held a thin carved rod taken from the chapel archives, one of the old tools used to guide the seal. He had forced the old knowledge open by pressure, by fear, and by a belief that he alone deserved the answer. He spoke plainly and without shame. He said the village had hidden power for too long, and that secrets only made weak people suffer. He said the guardians should be awakened and commanded, not feared, because fear could be turned into order. Father Caleb answered him with a sad and steady voice. He said Victor had missed the whole lesson of the old records. The guardians were not servants. They were protections tied to the hearts of those who entered the chamber. They responded to greed by closing tighter, and they responded to honesty by opening just enough to judge the soul in front of them. Victor laughed once, soft and sharp, because he believed judgment could be forced. Then he lifted the carved rod and pressed it toward the black basin, and the stone around the room shivered as if something below had begun to wake. The first guardian rose from the floor in the shape of a tall shadow made of stone dust and pale fire, with no face and no clear body, only a weight that pushed against the air. Then a second and a third followed, each one moving like a living wall, circling the basin in silence. Mara stepped closer to Igil, ready to move, while Father Caleb raised one hand and began speaking the old words he had kept hidden for years. The words were not a spell of force. They were a reminder of duty, sacrifice, and safekeeping. The guardians slowed for a moment, and that brief pause gave Igil time to understand the truth in front of him. The chamber was not asking who was strongest. It was asking who would protect others when fear grew large. Victor did not understand that. He pushed harder, and the guardians answered by turning toward him. A wave of cold pressure struck across the room, throwing dust into the air and forcing everyone back a step. Mara caught herself against a pillar. Father Caleb almost stumbled, but he stayed upright. Igil felt the mark on his right hand burn with white light, and the iron charm in his grip turned warm for the first time since they had entered the chamber. He remembered the old villagers speaking of the charm as a token of courage, but now he understood more. It was not magic by itself. It was a reminder to hold on when fear tried to make choices for him. Victor saw the light in Igil's hand and finally showed real hunger in his eyes. He realized too late that the chamber had chosen a different path than the one he wanted. Then came the twist that changed everything. Father Caleb looked at the glowing seal, then at Igil, and his calm face broke with a deep sadness. He admitted that the records had never said the marked hand belonged to a stranger. They said the mark would return to the bloodline of the first keeper because the chamber had been sealed by Igil's own family long ago, before the village had forgotten the truth. Igil froze as the meaning landed inside him. His hand was not only a key. It was a promise passed down through generations, made by someone who had once chosen to stand between the village and the dark below. Father Caleb had known this for some time, but he had waited until Igil was ready to hear it, because the weight of that truth might have crushed him earlier. Mara looked from Father Caleb to Igil, then gave a quick breath of surprise, but she did not step away. Instead, she moved closer because the truth made her trust him more, not less. Victor heard the same truth and grew more desperate. If the hand belonged to Igil by right, then Victor could not claim the chamber by force alone. He shouted that blood did not matter, that only power mattered, and he lunged toward the basin with the carved rod held high. But the guardian surged between him and the seal, driving him back with a heavy blast of cold light. The chamber shook, the stone lines flashed brighter, and the opening below the basin began to widen just enough to show a deeper glow, one that looked like a hidden sky inside the earth. Igil took one slow breath, and for the first time he did not fight the fear in his chest. He held it, faced it, and let it become focus. He understood that the chamber did not want a perfect hero. It wanted someone who would stay honest while standing in the dark. So he raised the marked hand toward the seal, and the white light spread across his fingers in clean lines that matched the old cracks in the stone. Father Caleb began to speak the final words of guidance, not to command Igil, but to steady him. Mara moved to his side and placed a hand near his shoulder, giving him the support he had needed from the start. Victor, now trapped between his own greed and the Guardians, slammed his gloved hand against the floor and tried one last time to force the opening wider, but the chamber rejected him again and again. The Guardians turned fully toward him, not in hatred but in clear refusal. Then the seal beneath Igil answered. The pale lines spread, the basin opened, and a stair of light appeared below, leading even deeper into the earth. From that hidden place came a sound like a distant voice calling from behind a closed door. None of them could tell whether it was warning, welcome, or something older than both. Igil stared into the opening, and the iron charm in his palm grew warm and steady. Victor stared too, his face hard with anger and fear, because he knew the moment had slipped from his control. The chamber had not ended its test. It had only revealed the next one, and as the light climbed the walls around them, all three of them understood that the real heart of Briar Glen was still waiting below. The stone opening breathed a cold light into the chamber, and the old chapel above seemed far away now. Briar Glen still sat on the mountain like a quiet wound, with its narrow paths, pine trees, and shuttered cottages waiting in the dark. Below that peaceful village, under the chapel floor and the old seal, something ancient had finally stirred awake. Sigil stood at the edge of the opening with his black hair damp from the mist, his lean body tense, and his tired gray eyes fixed on the light. The marked hand on his right side shone with a cold white glow, and the iron charm in his palm felt warm and steady, like it was trying to tell him not to run. Father Caleb stood behind him in his dark maroon robe, his gray hair neat, his thin frame careful and still, because he understood that some doors do not open by force alone. Mara stood close to his left, brown hair tied back, green eyes sharp, and her worn travel coat dusted with stone powder, because she had come too far to turn back now. And Victor stood on the other side, tall and straight, silver gray hair smooth, black gloves tight on his hands, his long dark coat falling like a shadow, because he wanted the chamber and everything below it for himself. No one spoke for a moment because the light on the walls was moving in slow lines, and the old seal was answering something only Sigil could feel. Victor broke the silence first, and his voice was calm in a way that made it worse. He said the chamber was finally showing respect, and that they should let him lead before the place turned against them. He had not come to Briar Glen for kindness, and he had not spent these long hours below the chapel to protect villagers. He wanted power because power would let him decide who was safe, who must obey, and who would be pushed aside when fear spread through the mountain roads. Father Caleb had seen that hunger in men before, and he knew it always called itself order. Mara crossed her arms and stared at Victor with open disgust, because she understood that every time he spoke about safety, he meant control. Sigil listened, but his attention kept drifting to the warm charm and the glowing mark, because the chamber seemed to be waiting for him to answer in a way words could not. Then the floor under their feet gave a low hum, and the closed door behind them shifted with a heavy stone scrape. Pale lines spread through the cracks in the old rock, and the pattern of the seal became clear for the first time. It was not just a lock, it was a test. The lines formed a circle with 3 broken paths, and each path led into a lower passage where the darkness was thicker than normal shadow. Father Caleb lowered himself to one knee and brushed dust from the stone, because his eyes were trained by years of reading old chapel records. He said the seal had been built by the first guardians of Briar Glen, long before the village had roads or bells or proper walls. Those guardians had hidden something powerful below the chapel, but they had also hidden a warning. The power beneath the hill would answer only to a heart that could hold fear without serving it. Victor laughed at that, but his laugh was thin and sharp. He said hearts did not matter, and that the world belonged to those willing to take what others feared to claim. The mark on Sigil's right hand pulsed once, and the chamber answered with a pulse of light from below. He looked at Father Caleb, then at Mara, then at Victor, and for the first time he understood why the charm had been placed in his palm. It was not a prize, it was a reminder. Whoever came here had to choose who they were when the room became dangerous. Sigil had lived too long as a tired traveler with a strange burden on his skin, always wondering whether the mark made him cursed or chosen. Now the chamber forced that question into the open. Father Caleb told him very softly that fear was not the enemy. Fear was only a warning. What mattered was whether a person used fear to protect others or to rule them. Mara nodded once because she had seen villages bend under cruel men who claimed they were keeping everyone safe. Victor stepped forward at once, and the air around him tightened with cold intent. He ordered them to move aside and let him take the lead because he believed the seal would respond to strength alone. When no one moved, his face hardened and the first real clash of the lower chamber began. Victor reached for the stone circle, but the seal flared bright and drove him back without touching him. The force was not cruel, but it was absolute, like a door refusing a thief. He staggered, caught himself, and anger flashed across his controlled face. The light on the floor shifted again, and 3 narrow passages opened with a rumble, each one lined with old stone and dim blue glow. The chamber was asking for a choice, and it would not allow all of them to walk the same road at once. Father Caleb understood the danger first. He said the old guardians had built trials to separate greed from trust, because greed always rushed toward the brightest thing and trust always learned to listen. Mara looked into the left passage, where the air felt colder, and she said she would take whatever path kept Victor from reaching the heart of the chamber alone. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were worried because she knew he could still cause harm if given space. Sigil stared into the middle passage, and the charm warmed harder, as if his own path had finally been named. Victor chose the right passage without waiting because he refused to accept any path that was not his own. They moved, the stones swallowed them one by one, and the chamber behind them dimmed as the three paths bent away from each other. Sigil went forward through a narrow descent where the walls were slick with old moisture, and the light from his mark painted the stone in pale white streaks. He felt the chamber pressing on him, not with hands, but with questions. Why was he here? Why did the mark answer now? Why did the old seal recognize him at all? In the stillness, the answer came as a memory not fully his own, like a dream passed through a wall of years. He saw a hooded figure in the chapel long before his arrival, laying the iron charm into a hidden groove beneath the altar stones. He saw Father Caleb younger, frightened but determined, helping to cover the place and promising to guard the truth until the right person came. This was the twist hidden in the seal. Sigil had not been brought here by accident. Someone had guided his path long before he knew the village existed, because the mark on his hand was not only a burden, it was a key made for this exact chamber. That truth changed everything in an instant, because Sigil had thought he was chasing the mystery, but the mystery had been waiting for him. At the same time, Mara found trouble in the left passage. She came upon a stone arch with carved guardian faces, and when she stepped near, the carvings began to glow and shift. The passage tested courage by showing her the village in ruin, the chapel broken, and the people of Briar Glen running in fear. She nearly froze because the image touched every part of her heart, but then she remembered why she had come. She was tired of watching strong men use fear to trap weaker people. She put one steady hand on the wall, took a hard breath, and walked through the vision instead of away from it. The image cracked like glass, and she forced the passage open with pure will. In the right passage, Victor found a chamber of mirrors made from black stone, and every mirror showed him the same thing. He was not a ruler. He was a man alone, surrounded by people who would never trust him. The sight enraged him because he hated being seen clearly. Sigil reached the end of his passage and found a round room with a basin of still water in the center. Above it hung a broken chapel bell, old and silent, suspended from a chain rusted by age. On the far wall, pale writing marked the final rule of the seal. Only the one who carried the burden without demanding command could wake the heart below. Sigil read it slowly, and the words settled into him like cold rain. He had spent so long thinking strength meant carrying pain without help. Now he understood that the chamber wanted something else. It wanted trust. It wanted him to accept the people who stood beside him, instead of trying to bear everything alone. Father Caleb entered through a side arch just after him, breathing hard but composed, and he confirmed what the wall said. The old guardians had never wanted a king below the chapel. They wanted a keeper who would listen. They had hidden the true heart of Briar Glen not as a weapon, but as a shield that could guard the village if the right people awakened it together. Then Victor arrived, and he was no longer calm. The mirrors had stripped away his patience, and the failure of the seal had made him reckless. He said the village needed a strong hand, not a crowd of weak hearts. He said Briar Glen would remain trapped in fear forever unless someone seized the power below and used it without hesitation. Father Caleb answered him with a quiet voice, saying that fear ruled only when decent people surrendered their choices. Mara stepped in beside Sigil, her expression fierce now, and she said Victor did not want safety. He wanted obedience. That hit the truth of him more deeply than any blow could have. Victor lifted one gloved hand, and the air in the chamber sharpened with dark intent, but the seal around the basin rose in bright lines before he could reach it. The chamber recognized the difference between force and trust. Sigil raised his marked hand, and the cold white light spread through his fingers and into the water. The basin shimmered, the bell above it rang once without being touched, and a hidden path began to open below. The heart of Briar Glen was still waiting, and now all of them could feel it calling, while Victor stood furious at the edge of the light, realizing the chamber had chosen neither his control nor the village-old fear, but something far harder to conquer. It had chosen the next step, and none of them yet knew what waited below. The hidden chamber of Briar Glen seemed to breathe as the stone path opened wider below the chapel floor, and the cold white glow from Sigil's hand spilled across the wet walls in thin, bright lines. The air down there was damp, old, and heavy with a strange silence that made every small sound feel too loud. Father Caleb stood close with his calm face tight with worry, his gray hair catching the pale light while his dark maroon robe brushed the broken stone. Mara stayed near Igil's shoulder, her brown hair tied back and her green eyes fixed on the opening below, because she knew that when a village kept a secret for many years, that secret always asked for a price. Victor stood a few steps away at the edge of the light, tall and still in his long dark coat, silver-gray hair shining like metal, his sharp eyes full of anger that he did not bother to hide. He had come to claim the power beneath the chapel, not to protect it, and that made him more dangerous than any wild force in the mountain. The old seal had chosen a different path now, and everyone there could feel it. If they failed to follow that path with care, the heart of Briar Glen might wake into something none of them could stop. Igil looked down at his marked right hand, and the cold white light pulsed once, then again, as if it had a slow heartbeat of its own. He was a young man with black hair, a lean body, pale skin, and tired gray eyes that had seen too many hard days for someone so young. His worn gray cloak hung from his shoulders, and the leather gloves on his hands looked small now against the strange glow. He had never wanted to be the center of any legend, but the mark had chosen him anyway, and that choice had dragged him into this chamber and every danger around it. Father Caleb had told him many times that power without purpose became ruin, so Igil kept his hands still and breathed slowly, trying not to let fear rule him. Mara, brave and sharp-minded, carried her small satchel close to her side and stepped toward him with a careful look. She was the kind of woman who never let fear speak first, and that was why the others trusted her in moments like this. She had not come to Briar Glen for glory, but because people she cared about were trapped under the weight of Victor plans. Now she reached into her satchel and placed the small iron charm into Igil's palm. It was worn dark silver, smooth from years of being held, and it felt heavier than it looked. "Keep your focus on that," she said quietly, her voice firm but warm. "If the chamber tries to shake you, hold on to something real." Igil closed his fingers around the charm, and the cold glow in his hand steadied at once. That small act mattered more than anyone first realized, because the seal below did not answer strength alone. It answered trust, and the chamber was already testing that truth. Victor saw the exchange, and his cold face tightened with clear frustration. He had silver-gray hair combed back, a tall frame, and the smooth, controlled posture of a man who believed every room should obey him. But this room did not obey. The bell above the basin still swayed gently from the touchless ring, and the new opening below led into darkness that even Victor could not fully read. He had expected the old seal to respond to force, fear, or bloodline pride, because that was how he understood the world. He believed that if he could reach the chamber heart, he could bend the village to his will and keep Briar Glen safe only by making everyone afraid of him. Long before this night, Victor had learned that people who feared too much would surrender too quickly, and he wanted that surrender for himself. He wanted the power under the chapel because he feared losing control over the mountain roots, the villagers, and the secret history that could expose how little he truly ruled. Yet the seal had rejected his touch and answered Igil instead, which meant Victor had become desperate. He stepped forward into the broken light and spoke with a voice like cold iron. "You think that charm will save you, boy? The thing below belongs to those with real will." Father Caleb lifted one careful hand, and his calm eyes met Victor's sharp stare. The old priest was a thin man with gray hair, wise and tired, but his quiet strength had helped hold Briar Glen together for many years. "What is below does not belong to greed," he said. "It belongs to truth." Victor laughed once, but the sound had no warmth in it. He was not angry only because he had failed. He was angry because he had been denied the one thing he thought he deserved most, the right to decide the fate of everyone else. That made him dangerous in a new way, because a man who cannot control the room may choose to break it. Then the stone path below the chapel shifted again, and a soft low hum rolled through the chamber like distant thunder. Pale lines appeared in the old cracks of the floor, and the hidden seal became visible at last, glowing beneath dust and age like a map drawn in light. Father Caleb gasped softly, because he knew those lines from old records no one had dared read aloud in many years. The seal had not been built to hide treasure. It had been made to hold back a guardian chamber, a place where Briar Glen once locked away a power that could either protect the village or overwhelm it if left in the wrong hands. The old stories were not fairy tales, and they were never about riches. They were warnings passed down by priests, keepers, and frightened elders who knew that some gifts could become disasters when pride touched them. Mara looked between the seal and Victor, and she understood the real danger at once. If Victor got into that chamber first, he would not simply steal power. He would tear loose the balance that had protected Briar Glen for generations. Sigil listened as the hum passed through his bones, and for one strange moment he felt something answer from deep below, not like a voice, but like a patient presence waiting to see what kind of person would arrive. The opening in the floor widened another inch, then another. Air rose from the dark with a smell like rain on stone. The descent had begun, and everyone knew they could not remain at the edge forever. Sigil tightened his grip on the iron charm, then raised his marked hand toward the opening. The white light touched the stone path, and the path brightened as if it recognized him. Victor saw that, and his eyes narrowed with something close to panic, which he tried to hide under his usual control. "Do not go down there without me," he said, but no one believed he meant to help. Father Caleb glanced at Mara, and Mara gave one short nod. They would go together because splitting apart now would only feed Victor advantage. Sigil moved first, placing one boot on the first rough stone step that had appeared from the floor. The chamber felt colder there, and the walls seemed to close around him as he began the descent. Mara followed at his side, her posture low and alert, ready to move if the hidden passage gave way or if Victor tried something reckless behind them. Father Caleb came next, one hand on the stone wall, the other holding the wooden cross at his chest as if it were a reminder and a promise. Victor started after them, but the glow beneath the chapel flared sharply, and the edge of the passage pushed back with enough force to make him halt. The seal was not done judging him, and that insult made his face harden into a grim mask. He stood above them now, partly lit by the white glow, partly buried in shadow, and for the first time he looked less like a ruler and more like a man afraid of being left outside the truth. Below, the narrow passage opened into a larger dark space, and the sound of water dripped in a steady pattern from somewhere ahead. Sigil felt the mark on his hand pulse again, and this time it did not feel like pain. It felt like a warning. The presence beneath the chapel was waiting, and it was waiting for more than his hand. It was waiting to see what he would choose when the next door opened. Mara whispered that they were not alone, and Father Caleb agreed at once, because the old stone had begun to carry a faint moving sound, like something deep in the dark shifting in answer to their arrival. Victor did not retreat, and he did not leave. He only watched from the opening above with cold patience returning to his face, because if he could not rule the path, he would try to trap them on it. Sigil looked ahead into the black passage, then back at the others, and for the first time he understood that the seal had not merely opened a route downward. It had called witnesses, and whatever waited in the heart of Briar Glen would judge all of them, one step at a time. The small iron charm grew warm in his fist, the white mark in his hand burned brighter, and the unseen chamber below answered with a slow, deep pulse that sounded almost like a sleeping giant turning in its rest. Then the floor beneath their feet gave one more soft tremor, and the darkness ahead shifted as if it had finally noticed them. Sigil took another step, and the others followed, while Victor remained above like a dark shadow at the mouth of the world. The hidden heart of Briar Glen was no longer distant. It was right in front of them, and it had just begun to wake. The air below the chapel was cold, tight, and old enough to feel heavy on the skin. Thin lines of pale light moved through the cracks in the stone floor, and they looked like veins under frozen glass. Sigil stood at the front with his marked right hand raised, while Father Caleb stayed close behind him with careful eyes and a steady breath. Mara held her small satchel against her side, and her brown hair fell across her cheek as she stared into the dim chamber. Above them, Victor remained at the opening like a patient hunter, silent and sure, because he wanted the seal for himself and knew that fear could make people easy to guide. The problem was simple now, and everyone there understood it. If the seal broke in the wrong way, Briar Glen could lose the barrier that had kept the hidden force below asleep for years. If Victor got control of that force first, he could use it to bend the village to his will, and that was exactly why he had followed them into the chapel from the start. The slow pulse came again from the dark ahead, deeper this time, and the stone under their boots answered with a small shiver. Sigil felt the cold white mark on his hand brighten, then tighten, as if some unseen force had just noticed him as much as he noticed it. He did not like that feeling, because the mark had always made him feel chosen and threatened at the same time. Father Caleb noticed the change in Sigil at once, and the older man, with his gray hair and calm but worried face, lifted one hand in a quiet warning. He was a priest, but he was also the person who had spent years learning the old stories of Briar Glen, and he knew that this seal had never been meant for greed or pride. It was a lock built by people who feared what lived below, and they had tied that lock to faith, bloodless sacrifice, and a promise that only the humble could open it. Mara looked from Sigil to Father Caleb, and her green eyes stayed sharp because she wanted her home safe more than she wanted any secret explained. She had grown up on these mountain paths, and every stone cottage above them meant someone she knew. To her, this was not just an ancient mystery. It was her village, her people, and the only life she had ever trusted. Sigil took another step, and the chamber answered with a deeper glow. The pale lines in the floor spread wider, tracing old symbols that looked like warning signs and prayer marks joined together. Then a thin seam of darkness split open in the center of the chamber wall, and cold air rolled out as if something huge had turned in sleep. Mara gasped and pulled back, but Father Caleb stayed still, because he knew that sudden fear could make things worse. Victor, still above, spoke at last in a low voice that carried down through the opening. He told them they were wasting time, and he said the seal belonged to whoever had the strength to command it. His words were smooth, but the motive behind them was not hard to see. Victor had never come to protect Briar Glen. He had come because he believed power should be taken, controlled, and used before anyone else could claim it. He saw the village as a locked chest, and he wanted the key. Sigil looked up toward the opening, and the cold light in his marked hand flickered with anger. He had already learned that Victor could sound reasonable while hiding something cruel, and that made him more dangerous than a loud enemy. Father Caleb told Sigil not to answer the bait, because Victor was trying to shake their focus before the seal fully awakened. Then the chamber changed. A low sound rolled through the stone, not loud but deep enough to be felt in the ribs. The far wall, which had looked solid only moments before, opened into a wide arch lined with more pale marks. Beyond it stood a round room cut from black stone, and at its center rested an old pedestal with an iron charm hanging from a chain around it. The charm was small, worn, and dark silver, but it glimmered in the weak light as if it still carried a purpose. Mara moved first because she always trusted action more than waiting, and she stepped toward it with careful boots. Father Caleb stopped her with a hand and pointed to the floor. There were narrow cracks there, and each crack matched the lines in Sigil's glowing hand. The old seal was reacting to him. It was not only opening, it was testing him. That truth landed hard, because if the seal judged him unworthy, the whole chamber could close, trap them inside, or send out whatever had been held back for so long. Sigil swallowed, then lowered his glowing hand toward the stone. The moment his skin came close, the light in the floor surged, and a circle of pale symbols rose around the pedestal like sleeping eyes opening all at once. From above, Victor gave a sharp, cold laugh, and it echoed down the shaft like a blade sliding from a sheath. He stepped into view at the edge of the opening, his silver-gray hair catching the faint light and his black gloves folded neatly over the railing stone. He said the seal was not holy at all, but a machine of control built by frightened people. He said it had been made to hide a guardian power, and that power had been kept from the world long enough. Father Caleb turned toward him and answered with quiet strength. He said that some things were hidden because the world was not ready to hold them, and that greed always called itself wisdom when it wanted permission. Victor's face hardened because the priest had seen through him too clearly. Mara shifted closer to Sigil, ready to stand beside him, and the village girl who had once only wanted to protect her neighbors now looked like someone ready to face a storm. Sigil finally understood something important in that moment. His hand was not just a key, it was a match. The seal had been waiting for the mark of someone who could either awaken the guardian below or break the lock forever. He had feared his power because it always felt strange, but now he saw why Father Caleb had never pushed him away. The old priest had believed from the beginning that Sigil might be the one person who could carry this burden without using it for harm. The pedestal trembled, and the iron charm lifted a little on its chain, as if drawn toward Sigil. Father Caleb told him to breathe slowly and think of the people above, the families in the stone cottages, the chapel bell, the lanterns on the hill, and the faces that would vanish if the seal failed. Sigil closed his tired gray eyes for a single heartbeat, and when he opened them again, his expression had changed. He was still afraid, but now his fear had a place to stand. He reached out with his marked hand, not to grab the charm, but to steady it. The light around the chamber softened, then spread in a clean circle across the black stone floor. For one short moment, everything held still. Then the chamber answered with a sudden deep pulse, much stronger than before, and the far wall began to turn like a door waking from a long dream. Mara stepped back and caught her breath. Father Caleb raised his hand and began a quiet prayer, not because he expected a miracle to arrive on command, but because faith gave shape to courage when nothing else could. Victor saw the opening below begin to widen, and for the first time his cold face showed a flash of concern. He had wanted power, but now he was seeing a power he did not fully control, and that meant the outcome was slipping away from him. The floor shook once more, harder this time, and dust drifted down through the chamber like gray snow. Then the seal split into a wide ring of light, and the room beyond became visible. No treasure sat there. No throne waited there either. Instead, deep markings covered the walls, and each one seemed to tell the same simple truth. The chamber below had not been made to store riches. It had been made to hold a guardian bond, and that bond was tied to the marked hand of Sigil. He stared at the markings, stunned, because the answer was both smaller and bigger than he had expected. He was not here to seize power. He was here because the old chapel had been waiting for someone who could hear it. Mara looked at him and then at Father Caleb, and she realized the priest had suspected this all along. That was the twist hidden inside the fear. Victor was not the center of the mystery. He was only the man trying to steal a lock he did not understand. The real choice belonged to Sigil, and he could feel that choice pressing down on him like the weight of the mountain above. Before he could speak, a deeper sound rolled out from the open chamber, and a shape moved in the darkness beyond the wall, slow and large, as if the sleeping guardian had finally opened its eyes. Everyone froze, because the next moment would decide whether the power below would rise to protect Briar Glen or overwhelm it completely. Victor leaned farther over the opening, his face sharp with hunger, while Sigil stood at the edge of the glowing seal with his hand raised and his heart racing, knowing the chamber had awakened at last, and knowing that the next step would change everything. The air inside the chamber felt cold and alive, and the glow from the seal spread across the stone floor in pale lines. Sigil stood still at the edge of that light, his black hair hanging near his tired gray eyes, while the bright mark on his right hand pulsed like a small heart made of winter fire. Victor leaned over the opening with his silver gray hair falling forward, his sharp face calm and hungry at the same time, because he believed the power below belonged to the person who could seize it first. Behind them, Father Caleb watched with his gray hair and worried eyes, and Mara stood close with her brown hair tied back, her green eyes wide and alert, because both of them understood the same terrible truth. If the chamber opened the wrong way, Briar Glen could be shaken apart, and if Victor gained control, the village would become his tool. The old chapel seal had awakened, and now everyone was waiting to see who it would obey. A deep sound rolled through the floor, slow and heavy, and the stone around the seal began to tremble in small cracks. Sigil felt the marked hand grow warm, then cold again, and he lowered it slowly as if some unseen force was watching his every move. Father Caleb stepped forward one careful pace, his maroon robe brushing the stone, and he said in a steady voice that the seal was not a door for greed, but a test for the one who carried it. Victor gave a thin smile and answered that tests were only games made by weak men who feared strength. Then he reached down toward the glow. Mara moved at once, catching his wrist before his fingers could touch the center crack, and the two of them locked in a fierce struggle that did not need blades to feel dangerous. Victor was stronger, but Mara was fast, and for a moment they were both trapped in the same sharp breath of time. Sigil wanted to shout, but the chamber gave another pulse, and the light on his hand answered it like a call. He understood then that the seal was not simply waiting for touch, it was waiting for choice. The glow spread wider, and the cracks in the floor formed a circle beneath Sigil and Victor alike. A low pressure filled the chamber, pressing against ears and chests, and the sound of the guardian rose from below like a giant turning in sleep. Father Caleb lifted the small iron charm from his palm, the worn dark silver token that had been passed to him long ago by a village elder who feared this day would come. He called to Sigil and told him that the charm was not magic by itself, but a reminder to keep the mind steady when fear tried to break it. Sigil took one breath, then another, and closed his marked hand around the iron charm. The cold metal grounded him, and the pulse in his hand slowed enough for him to think. He remembered the long road to this chamber, the quiet fear in the village, and the way people had looked at him as if he were both hope and trouble. He had wanted to run from that burden. Now he knew that running would only hand the chamber to Victor. So Sigil stepped forward into the center of the light, and the seal reacted at once. The floor shone bright, and a shape began to rise in the haze beneath the chapel stone. It was not a monster in the simple way Victor had expected, and it was not a servant waiting to obey him. It was a guardian, vast in presence, made of pale light and old stone memory, with a face like a carved statue and eyes that opened one slow inch at a time. The chamber filled with a deep voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, asking who had come to claim what was buried below. Victor finally lost his calm and said the chamber was his prize, because strength gave him the right to rule and the village had been weak for too long. He spoke of the mountain roads, the shortages, the fear, and the years he had spent watching people cling to hope instead of seizing control. He believed order could only come through command, and command could only come through power. Father Caleb answered that power without mercy always turned into ruin. Mara stood beside him and said that Briar Glen needed protection, not a master. Sigil listened to them all, and for the first time he saw Victor clearly. Victor was not driven by simple cruelty alone. He was driven by fear of being powerless again, and that fear had hollowed him out until he could only measure life by control. Then came the twist that changed everything. The Guardian spoke again, and this time its words were not for Victor. It named Sigil as the key, not because he was the strongest, but because his marked hand had once been touched by the same bloodline that helped build the seal. Father Caleb looked stunned, and then he remembered the old records hidden in the chapel chest. He had not told Sigil before, because he feared the truth would weigh too heavily on the young man, but the seal had been made by Sigil family ancestors and kept hidden by priests to protect the village from those who would misuse it. That was why the mark had appeared on Sigil's hand. That was why the glow answered him. He was not chosen by accident, and he was not meant to command the Guardian like a weapon. He was meant to decide whether the Guardian should remain sleeping, wake in defense, or seal the chamber forever. Victor heard this and went still for one sharp second, because his plan had cracked open. Then his face hardened again, and he moved to seize the choice by force. He shoved past Mara, reached toward Sigil, and shouted that bloodline meant nothing if he could take the hand that carried it. Chamber reacted before Victor could reach him. Stone lines lit up in a wide ring, and a wall of light surged between them, driving Victor back several steps. He hit the floor hard, slid across the stone, and struck a broken pillar with a sharp crack that made everyone flinch. He was not hurt beyond the shock of the fall, but his control was gone, and that was more dangerous than any wound. The Guardian lowered its gaze, and the whole room quieted as if the mountain itself were listening. Sigil stood in the center, shaking now, because he understood that the choice was real and that any wrong answer could wake a force too large to guide. Father Caleb told him to trust the reason the seal had waited so long. Mara told him to think of the people above, of children in warm homes and lanterns in the windows, and of the village that had no power except hope in each other. Victor, now rising with anger in his eyes, promised that if the chamber would not obey him, he would break the village until someone did. Yet even as he spoke, a deeper rumble rolled through the floor, warning that the Guardian would not allow this conflict to continue much longer. Sigil looked down at the iron charm in his hand, then at the light on his marked skin, and he finally understood what the chamber wanted from him. It did not want greed. It did not want fear. It wanted someone who would carry the burden without using it to rule others. So he lifted his marked hand toward the open seal, not in challenge but in acceptance, and he spoke clearly into the dark. He said the Guardian should protect Briar Glen, but never follow the orders of a selfish heart. He said the power below must remain bound until the village truly needed it, and he asked for the seal to answer only to mercy and need. The chamber flashed at once, bright enough to turn every shadow white for a heartbeat. The Guardian opened its mouth as if to speak a final judgment, and a strong wind surged up through the floor, lifting Mara hair and dragging Victor coat backward. Father Caleb crossed himself and lowered his head. Sigil held his ground, even as the pressure pushed hard against his chest. Then the Guardian began to move again, and this time the old stone ring around the seal split wider than before. A hidden path, steep and glowing, appeared below them, leading deeper into the mountain. The chamber had accepted his answer, but it had also revealed that the true heart of the secret still waited below, and whatever slept there was now only one step away from waking completely. The glowing path beneath the chapel felt less like a stairway and more like a judgment, cut straight into the mountain and lit by a cold, pale shimmer that made every stone look sharp and tired. Sigil stood at the edge for one long breath, his black hair falling near his tired gray eyes, while the cold white mark on his right hand pulsed like a quiet warning. Behind him, the broken chamber held the heavy silence of the old seal, and above him, Briar Glen still slept under its warm lanterns and narrow paths, not knowing how close the danger now stood. Father Caleb, a thin older man with gray hair and a calm but worried face, watched from the chamber with his dark maroon robe hanging close around his frame, his wooden cross resting against his chest as if he needed its weight to stay steady. Mara, the brave woman with brown hair and alert green eyes, shifted near the doorway with her worn travel coat and small satchel, her stance saying she wanted to follow but feared what she might find. They all understood the same truth now, and it had to be spoken plainly before the mountain decided for them. If the thing below woke fully, it could rise through the chapel seal and spread its force into the village, breaking the peace of Briar Glen and turning every safe place into a place of fear. Victor wanted that power, and that made him more dangerous than any storm. Victor appeared on the far side of the chamber just as Sigil took his first step downward. He moved with the smooth control of a man who believed the world should obey him, his silver gray hair neat, his sharp eyes cold, and his long dark coat falling around him like a shadow with a human shape. He wore black gloves, high boots, and layered dark clothing, and every part of him looked prepared for a contest he expected to win. He had followed the signs beneath the chapel because he believed the ancient force below was not a curse at all, but a weapon locked away by frightened people who did not deserve it. Victor wanted to claim it not for glory alone, but because he thought strength was the only thing that could keep the weak from being crushed by the world. That belief had twisted in him for years, and now it drove him forward with perfect patience. He looked at Sigil and spoke as if the mountain already belonged to him. He said the boy could still step aside because the true burden was too heavy for someone so young. Sigil did not answer with anger. He only tightened his hand around the small iron charm in his palm, the dark silver token that had been given to steady fear and sharpen focus. Then he moved down into the glow, one careful step after another, while Father Caleb and Mara stayed behind at the opening, watching both him and Victor vanish into the stone light. The stairway bent deeper than any of them expected, and the air changed as they descended. It grew colder, drier, and full of a low pressure that pressed against the skin like a silent hand. The walls were cut with old marks that matched the lines of the seal above, and every few steps the cold white glow on Sigil's marked hand answered those marks with a faint pulse. He did not yet understand the full rule, but he understood enough to keep going. The mountain was not only hiding something, it was testing the one chosen to reach it. Each time he passed a carved symbol, a memory flashed through him, not as a vision of the future, but as fragments of old voices and old fear. He saw villagers long ago kneeling in the chapel, saw hands pressing the same seal into the floor, and saw someone placing the iron charm into the stone before leaving it behind for another generation. That memory told him one clear thing: the seal had not been made to trap a monster alone. It had been made to hold back a promise, a power that could protect the village if handled with care, or destroy it if taken by greed. Victor heard the same truth, but he refused to accept the warning hidden inside it. He pressed onward with a colder smile, and when he reached a wider chamber halfway down, he found a ring of stone pillars around a pool of dim light. At the center of that chamber stood a sealed door covered in pale cracks, and the glow around it matched the mark on Sigil's hand exactly. For the first time, Victor showed real interest in someone other than himself. He asked Sigil what he had seen because he wanted the answer before he made his move. Sigil said only that the mountain wanted the truth, not a thief. Victor's expression hardened, and that small change said more than any shout could have said. Mara and Father Caleb did not stay behind for long. Caleb had spent his life serving Briar Glen, and he knew that if the mountain had opened once, it might open wider unless someone with steady faith followed the path. Mara, who had come to the chapel because her village had been shaken by strange signs and whispered warnings, would not let Sigil face the darkness alone. She pushed into the stairway with her satchel bouncing against her side, and Caleb followed with careful steps, the iron calm of a man who knew fear but refused to obey it. When they reached the wider chamber, they found Sigil standing near the sealed door and Victor circling it like a patient hawk. The tension in the room was sharp enough to feel. Caleb studied the old stone and realized the chamber had a second rule, one that had not been shared with the village for many years. The seal did not open for strength alone, it opened for balance. The marked hand could wake the lock, but only a willing heart could decide what came next. That was why the old priests had guarded the secret. They feared that if the power below was taken by force, it would answer the one who had no restraint, and that answer could overwhelm the mountain from within. Victor listened to this with a cold, quiet smile, because he had already decided that restraint was just another word for weakness. Then he stepped forward and tried to force the door with both hands, pressing his will against the stone. The chamber answered with a violent pulse of light, and the floor trembled under everyone at once. The attempt failed, and Victor was forced back a full step, but he did not fall. Instead, he stared at Sigil with new respect and new hate mixed together, because now he knew the boy was the key he could not yet take. The true twist came when Sigil placed the iron charm against the glowing cracks in the sealed door. He had expected it to unlock the chamber, but instead the stone answered with a voice from the past, soft and clear as if someone were standing just beyond the wall. The voice belonged to the first guardian, the one whose name the old records had hidden, and it revealed the thing that had been missed for generations. The power below was never meant to stay buried forever. It had been sealed because the people of Briar Glen had once feared their own greed, and they had asked the first guardian to keep the power hidden until someone could prove they would use it to protect, not control. The marked hand was not a random curse or blessing. It was a family mark passed down through the line of those who had once agreed to guard the chamber. Sigil had not been chosen by accident. His bloodline had reached back to the vow itself, and the cold white light in his hand was the sign that the old promise was calling him home. Caleb lowered his head when he heard this, because he finally understood why the chapel seal had waited for Sigil and ignored others. Mara looked at Sigil with wide eyes, not with fear now, but with the sudden hope that he could carry something larger than himself. Victor, however, heard only one part of the truth. He heard that the power could be controlled. He took one fast step toward the door, meaning to break the gathering and force the chamber open before Sigil could choose the path of protection. Sigil raised his marked hand at once, and the cold light burst brighter, meeting Victor in the middle of the chamber. The force between them did not explode into fire or ruin. Instead, it became a hard white wall that shook the room, shoved Victor backward, and cracked the dust from the ceiling in a rain of stone powder. Victor braced himself, his eyes wide for the first time, and the chamber floor began to split along hidden lines, showing that the next level below had heard the clash and was now stirring. No one had time to celebrate, because the mountain had answered the struggle with a deeper sound, low and slow, like a giant turning in sleep. The sealed door opened just enough for a narrow flow of white light to spill out, and that light carried shapes inside it, shapes that were not fully solid and not fully gone. Caleb called for everyone to stay still, because he knew a reckless move could wake the chamber too fast. Mara grabbed Sigil by the sleeve and pulled him back from the edge, not because she doubted him, but because she trusted him enough to keep him alive. Victor, still burning with anger and need, stared into the opening and saw what he wanted most: a source of power older than the chapel, older than the village, and maybe older than the fear that had shaped his whole life. Yet the chamber did not welcome him. The light folded around his gloves and pushed him away, as if it could sense his motive and reject it. That rejection hit him harder than any blow. Sigil saw it happen, and for the first time he understood Victor not as a simple enemy, but as a man who had built himself around fear and called it strength. That understanding did not make Victor safe, but it changed the shape of the fight. Sigil took a slow breath, steadied his marked hand, and stepped toward the light with a new kind of courage. He was no longer moving only because he had to. He was choosing to guard the truth, even if that truth hurt, even if it forced him to stand against a man who wanted the same power for the wrong reason. The chamber opened wider by a few inches, and from deep below came another pulse, stronger than before, as if something inside the mountain had now sensed the choice above and had begun to wake with purpose. Sigil looked back once at Mara and Caleb, then forward into the glow, and the story of the seal turned toward a deeper darkness that was now impossible to ignore. Beneath Briar Glen, the chapel stones trembled as the hidden chamber widened. Cold white light spilled through the cracks, and the air felt heavy, as if the mountain itself had begun to breathe. Sigil stood at the edge of the opening with his marked right hand glowing, while Mara and Father Caleb stayed close behind him, both knowing that one wrong choice could let the ancient power below escape into the village above. Victor stepped from the shadows with calm eyes and a sharp face, and his silver-gray hair caught the light like metal. He was not wild, and he was not foolish. He wanted the power under the mountain because he believed fear could only be stopped by control. In his mind, a strong ruler was safer than a free people. That was why he had followed the seal, studied the old signs, and waited for the right moment to claim what he thought the mountain owed him. Father Caleb raised his voice and finally told the truth in full. The old chapel seal was never built to serve a master, and it was never made to reward greed. It was made by guardians long ago to answer a single kind of person, one who would protect the weak and refuse the easy path of force. That was why Igil had been marked, and that was why the mountain had responded to him from the start. Mara squeezed the iron charm in her palm, because now she understood that her own fear had almost helped Victor win. The chamber pulsed again, stronger this time, and Victor rushed forward when he realized the seal was choosing Igil. The two men clashed in the glow, not with blades, but with will, pressure, and force. Victor tried to overwhelm the mark with control, but Igil remembered every warning, every lie, and every person in Briar Glen who would suffer if he failed. He lowered his hand into the light, chose trust over pride, and opened the seal just enough to guide the energy downward instead of letting it burst free. A deep sound rolled through the mountain, and then the chamber went still. Victor stumbled back, his plan broken, and the strange power of the seal locked around him like a cage of light. He was not destroyed, but he was fully driven back, unable to bend the mountain to his will. Mara rushed to Igil, Caleb placed a steady hand on his shoulder, and the old chapel above them settled into silence. Igil looked at his glowing hand, then at the others, and for the first time he did not see only danger. He saw responsibility, and he finally understood that true strength meant protecting what power could never own.